Sometimes a war changes not when guns fall silent, but when ordinary people quietly decide to treat each other like human beings. The message arrived before sunrise, typed on a narrow strip of paper that still smelled faintly of ink and dust from the telegraph room. The header was simple, confidential. Beneath it, only a few clipped lines addressed to the regional command office outside San Angelo, Texas. Investigate the Bennett Ranch arrangement. Possible irregular contact between German POW labor unit and civilian household. Report findings immediately. The clerk who placed the message on the wooden desk did not linger to read the rest. He had already delivered dozens of notices that morning, most of them routine, supply updates, transportation logs, weather advisories for training flights drifting over the wide plains. But this one carried a tone that felt different, colder somehow, like a quiet ripple moving through still water. By the time the sun began lifting over the Texas horizon, Major Ethan Brooks was already reading it in silence. Brooks had been in uniform long enough to recognize the language of concern disguised as procedure. He leaned back in his chair, the wooden legs creaking softly across the office floor, and read the lines again. There was no accusation in the message, no anger, just a suggestion that something unusual had taken root nearly 30 miles away on a ranch most officers barely knew existed. Outside the office window the morning was already warming. The Texas sky stretched endless and pale blue above fields that rolled toward the horizon like a calm ocean of dust and grass. Brooks folded the message once, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Investigate. That was the entire assignment. No explanation. No urgency. Just quiet curiosity from the War Department, which in military terms could sometimes be more serious than any order barked through a megaphone. Meanwhile, the Bennett Ranch woke the way it always did, slowly, with the sound of wind pushing through mesquite trees and the faint creak of barn doors shifting in the early heat. The ranch sat far enough from town that the only regular noise came from cattle moving across the pasture and the distant rumble of trucks traveling the state road miles away. The house itself was simple, built of weathered boards that had faded to the color of old wheat. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, its wooden steps worn smooth by years of boots and work gloves and summer dust. Inside, the kitchen light flickered on before the sun fully cleared the horizon. Ruth Bennett moved across the room with practiced quiet, tying the apron behind her waist while the coffee pot began its slow, steady hiss on the stove. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the house, warm and familiar, blending with the faint scent of flour and with smoke that always seemed to live in the walls. On the far side of the kitchen, a young woman stood near the sink, sleeves rolled neatly above her elbows. Her movements were careful, efficient, almost military in their precision. She rinsed a row of tin cups, setting them upside down on a cloth towel, as if following instructions no one had spoken aloud. Her name was Annalise Kruger, though most people on the ranch had begun calling her Annie because it was easier to say. Months earlier she had arrived as part of a labor transfer from a prisoner of war camp farther east. The official paperwork described her simply as German auxiliary personnel assigned to agricultural duty. The reality was quieter than that description suggested. Annie did not speak often. When she did, her English came slowly, shaped by a soft German accent that turned certain words into careful puzzles. But her hands moved with confidence around the ranch. She understood tools. She understood animals. She understood the rhythm of work that began before the sun and ended long after the sky turned the deep orange color of a Texas evening. Ruth Bennett watched her for a moment while stirring the coffee. There was something unusual about the young woman, though Ruth had never been able to describe it clearly. Not fear exactly. Not sadness either. More like a steady calm that refused to break even when the world around it shifted. Annie placed the last cup on the towel and glanced toward the open window. The morning air drifted through, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant rain that might or might not arrive by evening. Somewhere out in the pasture a horse snorted softly, shaking its mane as the first sunlight touched the fences. "Coffee is ready," Ruth said finally, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. Annie nodded once. "Thank you." Her words were simple, but the tone carried quiet respect, the kind that did not need explanation. A moment later the back door opened and Cole Bennett stepped into the kitchen, brushing dust from his hat. He was tall, sunburned from years under open skies, and moved with the slow confidence of someone who had spent most of his life solving problems with patience instead of noise. He paused just inside the doorway, noticing Annie beside the sink. For half a second the three of them stood there in the morning light, an arrangement that would have looked ordinary to anyone passing through the house. A rancher, his wife, a worker helping prepare the day's coffee before the cattle needed attention. But the war had a way of making ordinary moments complicated. Because Annie Kruger was not technically a worker, she was a prisoner of war. And according to the official regulations filed somewhere in a government cabinet hundreds of miles away, prisoners of war were not supposed to stand inside a family kitchen at sunrise pouring coffee beside the rancher's wife. Yet the moment passed without comment. Cole poured a cup and leaned against the counter, staring out the window toward the long line of fences stretching into the pale Texas distance. The ranch needed help. Everyone in the county knew that. The war had taken most of the young men overseas, leaving farms and ranches stretched thin across thousands of acres. When the Army suggested temporary labor assignments from nearby POW camps, few landowners argued with the idea. The arrangement was supposed to be simple. Prisoners worked during the day. Guards checked in regularly. No personal contact beyond basic instructions. No gifts. No unnecessary conversation. No exceptions. That was the rule written neatly on the official forms. But rules had a strange way of bending under the quiet weight of everyday life. Annie handed Cole a clean cup without looking directly at him. He accepted it with a brief nod. The exchange lasted less than 2 seconds. No words. No attention drawn to it. Yet somewhere 30 miles away a folded message rested inside Major Ethan Brooks's uniform pocket, carrying a question that would soon travel down the dusty Texas road toward this very kitchen. Because someone, somewhere, had noticed that the Bennett Ranch did not look exactly like the regulations expected. And once the War Department noticed something, it rarely forgot. The road from San Angelo to Bennett Ranch was not marked on most maps. It stretched across dry Texas land like a thin brown thread, winding between low hills, cattle fences, and miles of open pasture where the wind rarely stopped moving. Shortly after 8 in the morning, a dark Army sedan rolled onto that road, its tires stirring a slow trail of pale dust that drifted behind it like smoke. Major Ethan Brooks drove with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, his other elbow leaning against the open window frame. The warm air carried the scent of sun-baked grass and distant rain that had not yet arrived. He had read the message again before leaving the office, though the words had not changed overnight. Investigate the Bennett Ranch arrangement. Possible irregular contact. Report findings. The language was careful. Government language always was. It did not accuse. It suggested. But Brooks understood the quiet weight behind those suggestions. When Washington noticed something unusual, someone eventually had to explain it. The sedan passed a line of grazing cattle that lifted their heads briefly before returning to the grass. A wooden sign nailed to a fence post appeared beside the road after another mile. Bennett Ranch. The letters were faded but still clear. Brooks slowed the car and turned through the open gate. The ranch unfolded ahead of him in a wide sweep of land that stretched nearly 2,000 acres in every direction. A barn stood near the center of the property, its red paint weathered by years of sun and wind. Beyond it, a long fence line curved toward a distant pasture where several horses moved slowly through the grass. The place did not look unusual. It looked exactly like dozens of other ranches across West Texas. Quiet, hard-working, self-contained. Brooks parked the sedan near the barn and stepped out, adjusting his jacket as the heat settled around him. Even in the early morning the temperature had already climbed past 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air carried the dry heaviness of a long summer day ahead. He removed his hat briefly and looked across the property. Movement caught his eye near the fence line. A young woman stood beside a gray horse, her hand resting lightly along the animal's neck while she checked the strap of a saddle. The horse shifted its weight, but the woman remained calm, speaking softly in a voice too quiet for Brooks to hear from that distance. Her movements were steady and precise. Not hurried, not nervous, just confident. Brooks recognized that kind of confidence. It came from routine, from repetition, from knowing exactly what needed to be done without asking anyone else for instructions. He walked slowly across the yard, boots pressing into the dry dirt with a soft crunch. As he approached, The horse lifted its head slightly, and the woman turned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Annie Kruger stood straight, the morning sunlight touching the pale strands of hair that had escaped the loose knot behind her head. Her sleeves were rolled neatly to the elbows, and a thin line of dust marked the side of her work shirt where she had brushed against the barn wall earlier. Brooks studied her face carefully. He had read the personnel records before leaving the office. Age, 24. German Auxiliary Communications Unit attached to a field hospital in North Africa before capture. Transferred to a prisoner labor camp in Louisiana and later reassigned to agricultural duty in Texas. The file had been brief. Efficient. Like most military paperwork, it reduced a human life to a handful of lines typed on thin government paper. Annie spoke first. Her English carried the same careful rhythm Ruth Bennett had noticed weeks earlier. "Good morning, sir." Brooks nodded politely. "Good morning." He glanced toward the horse. "You handle animals often." It was not a question. Annie gave a small nod. "My grandfather kept horses when I was a child. I learned early." The horse shifted again, and she tightened the saddle strap with one quick motion. Brooks noticed something else then. The way the animal responded to her voice. Calm. Trusting. That kind of relationship between a horse and a handler did not appear overnight. It took patience. It took time. And time was exactly the detail Washington seemed interested in. From the direction of the house, the screen door opened with a familiar creak. Cole Bennett stepped out onto the porch, his hat already settled low against the growing sunlight. He paused when he saw the army sedan near the barn, then began walking toward Brooks with the steady pace of a man who had spent his life greeting visitors without unnecessary drama. "Morning, Major," he said when he reached them. Brooks turned slightly. "Mr. Bennett. I hope I am not interrupting your work." Cole shrugged lightly. "Work never stops out here, but we can always spare a few minutes." Brooks looked around the yard again. He noticed small details now that he stood closer. A stack of tools leaning neatly against the barn wall. A row of clean buckets drying upside down beside the pump. The saddle Annie had just tightened was not army equipment. It belonged to the ranch. The leather had been worn smooth by years of use. That detail lingered in Brooks's mind. According to the official arrangement, prisoner labor units were supposed to use designated equipment under supervision. Personal property was rarely involved. Yet here stood Annie Kruger adjusting a saddle as naturally as if she had lived on the ranch for years. Brooks spoke carefully. "The War Department reviews labor placements from time to time. Routine procedure." Cole Bennett nodded once. "Of course." Annie remained silent beside the horse, her attention returning to the reins in her hands. Brooks watched her for another moment. She did not appear anxious. She did not look toward Cole for guidance. She simply continued her work with the quiet focus of someone accustomed to responsibility. Brooks had visited many agricultural labor sites during the past year. Most prisoner workers behaved differently when officers arrived. They stood straighter. They waited for orders. They avoided unnecessary movement. Annie did none of those things. She finished checking the saddle and gently led the horse a few steps forward, speaking to it again in that soft, steady tone. The animal followed her easily. Brooks felt a small shift in his understanding then. Nothing dramatic. Just a quiet recognition that the situation described in the message might not be as simple as the paperwork suggested. Somewhere far away, inside an office filled with maps and reports, someone had written a short sentence asking him to investigate irregular contact. Standing there in the Texas sunlight, watching a German prisoner calmly guide a ranch horse toward the pasture while the ranch owner discussed weather and fence repairs, Brooks realized the truth might be both simpler and more complicated than any official report expected. The sun had climbed higher by the time Major Ethan Brooks followed Cole Bennett toward the long fence that marked the edge of the horse pasture. The morning heat was settling across the land with the quiet certainty of a Texas summer day, pushing the temperature steadily toward 90 degrees Fahrenheit even before noon. Dust shifted gently across the yard whenever the wind moved, carrying the dry scent of grass and cedar from the distant hills. Annie Kruger walked ahead of them, guiding the gray horse through the open gate with a calm hand resting lightly on the reins. The animal moved without hesitation, stepping into the pasture where several other horses lifted their heads briefly before returning to the grass. Brooks watched the interaction closely. The horse trusted her. That was clear. Trust between a horse and a handler came from repetition, from small routines repeated day after day until the animal no longer questioned the human voice guiding it. Brooks had grown up around farms in Oklahoma before joining the Army. He knew what he was looking at. That level of familiarity did not appear overnight. It meant Annie had been working here regularly, perhaps longer than the paperwork suggested. Cole Bennett leaned his arms across the top rail of the fence, staring out at the pasture the way ranchers often did when measuring the condition of their land. Major Brooks stood beside him quietly. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The only sounds came from the low rustle of wind across the grass and the distant clink of metal tools shifting near the barn. Finally, Brooks asked the question that had been forming since he stepped out of the car. How long has she been working here? Cole did not look at him right away. He watched Annie for another moment as she released the horse and gave its neck a brief, reassuring pat. The animal moved away calmly toward the others grazing farther out. A little over 3 months, Cole said at last. Brooks turned slightly. 3 months is longer than most temporary labor rotations. Cole nodded slowly. That is true. Annie began walking back toward the fence, brushing a line of dust from her hands as she approached. She stopped a few feet away, standing with the quiet posture Brooks had already noticed earlier. She did not interrupt the conversation. She simply waited. Brooks studied her again. The War Department guidelines for prisoner labor were very clear. Agricultural assignments could be approved for limited periods under supervision. The goal was efficiency. Workers filled temporary shortages until local conditions stabilized. Then the prisoners returned to their designated camps. The system was meant to be predictable, organized, easy to record on government forms. What Brooks was seeing here did not quite match that pattern. He spoke again, his voice measured and calm. The arrangement appears to be functioning well. Cole allowed himself a faint smile. We needed the help. Most of the younger men from this county are overseas right now. The ranch does not slow down just because the war moved across the ocean. Brooks nodded. That much he understood. Across the United States, thousands of farms and ranches had faced the same reality since 1942. Labor shortages had forced the government to consider unusual solutions. German prisoners captured overseas were eventually transported across the Atlantic and assigned to camps scattered through rural states. Under careful supervision, many of them worked in agriculture, helping maintain food production while American soldiers fought abroad. On paper, the program was practical, efficient, but the papers never described what happened when those prisoners became part of daily life on a ranch like this. Brooks looked toward Annie. Do you prefer the work here? She answered without hesitation. Yes, sir. It is honest work. Her tone carried no drama, no attempt to impress him, just a simple statement of fact. Brooks continued studying the pasture for a moment before asking another question. Were you trained with animals before the war? Annie shook her head gently. Not trained in the formal way. My grandfather had horses. When I was young, I helped care for them. She paused briefly, choosing her words carefully in English. Animals understand calm voices. If you do not frighten them, they usually do not frighten you. Cole chuckled quietly at that observation. She learned the routine faster than any hand I have hired in the past 5 years, he said. Brooks noticed something subtle in Cole Bennett's voice then. Not pride exactly. Respect. The kind that developed between people who worked side by side through long days of difficult labor. Brooks folded his arms across the fence rail and looked across the wide Texas landscape stretching beyond the pasture. Somewhere far behind him in Washington, officials read reports and studied regulations. They saw numbers on charts. Agricultural output, labor assignments, camp populations. None of those charts showed what he was looking at now. A rancher discussing the weather with a German prisoner who knew how to handle horses better than some local workers. Annie shifted her weight slightly, sensing the conversation had reached a quiet pause. Major Brooks spoke again after a moment. The War Department asks questions when situations appear unusual. Annie did not react with surprise. She nodded once as if she had already considered that possibility long ago. Rules exist for a reason, she said quietly. Brooks raised an eyebrow slightly. And do you believe those rules are being broken here? Annie looked across the pasture toward the horses moving slowly through the grass. Her answer came slowly, measured like every word she spoke. I believe people are doing the work that needs to be done. The wind moved across the open land again, lifting small spirals of dust along the road where Brooks had parked his car earlier. In the distance, a truck could be heard traveling along the state highway miles away, its engine humming faintly through the warm air. Brooks considered her words carefully. Annie Kruger had not defended herself. She had not offered excuses. She had simply described the reality of the ranch in the same quiet way someone might describe the weather. That honesty was unusual. Most people facing an Army investigation tried to shape their answers carefully. Annie did not appear interested in shaping anything. Cole pushed away from the fence rail and glanced toward the barn. "We should check the water tanks before the heat climbs any higher," he said. Brooks nodded slowly. "Of course." Annie walked ahead again toward the barn, her pace steady as she crossed the dusty yard. Brooks remained by the fence for another moment, watching her move through the sunlight with the calm confidence of someone who had already found her place in this strange corner of Texas. The message in his pocket had asked him to investigate irregular contact. Standing there under the wide sky, Brooks realized the real question might not be whether the rules had been bent. The real question was why bending them here had produced something that looked surprisingly stable. By late morning, the heat had settled across the Bennett Ranch like a heavy blanket, the kind of slow Texas warmth that crept into every board, every fence post, every patch of dry earth until the entire landscape seemed to breathe the same steady rhythm. Major Ethan Brooks walked beside Cole Bennett toward the barn, where a row of water tanks stood beneath a narrow strip of shade. The metal sides of the tanks already felt warm to the touch, even though the sun had not yet reached its highest point. Annie Kruger was there ahead of them, lifting the lid of one tank and checking the water level with a calm, practiced movement. She did not hurry when she worked. Every motion had the same quiet efficiency Brooks had noticed earlier near the horse pasture. She replaced the lid carefully and wiped a small ring of dust from the rim with a cloth before stepping back. Cole leaned down to inspect the gauge attached to the side of the tank. "Still holding steady," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The cattle had enough water for now. Brooks watched Annie again while the wind drifted through the open barn doors carrying the smell of hay and warm wood. The ranch felt organized in a way that could not be explained only by habit. Tools were stacked in precise rows along the interior wall. The floor had been swept recently. Even the feed sacks were arranged neatly against the far corner. Brooks had visited enough farms during the past year to recognize the difference between order created by routine and order created by careful attention. Annie moved toward the next tank, lifting its lid with the same steady motion. Cole noticed Brooks observing the scene and gave a small shrug. "She does not like things left unfinished," he said. Brooks nodded slowly. "Discipline can be useful on a ranch." Cole smiled faintly. "It can be useful anywhere." Annie finished checking the second tank and turned toward them. The sunlight filtering through the barn doorway caught the dust floating gently through the air around her, turning the particles into thin golden threads that drifted quietly in the warm light. Major Brooks stepped closer to the shade of the barn wall. "How did the arrangement begin?" he asked Cole after a moment. Cole rested his arms against the side of the tank, considering the question. "It started the same way it started for half the ranches in this county. The war took the young men, and the work stayed behind. Someone from the local army office came around asking if we could use extra hands." Brooks listened without interrupting. Cole continued. "They said the prisoners would be supervised. Said the arrangement was temporary, just until things balanced out again." Brooks glanced toward Annie. "And you agreed?" Cole nodded once. "A ranch does not stop because the world is at war. Cattle still need feeding. Fences still break. Water still needs checking." Annie stood quietly a few steps away, her hands resting loosely at her sides. Brooks noticed that she did not try to join the conversation, but she also did not leave the area as some prisoners might have done when officers spoke with civilians. She remained present, listening calmly. Brooks spoke again. "The message I received suggested the arrangement here has drawn attention." Cole tilted his head slightly. "Attention from whom?" "From people who prefer clear categories," Brooks answered. "Prisoners here. Civilians there. Work defined by lines on paper." Cole looked out across the yard where the barn cast a long shadow across the dry ground. "Paper does not mend fences," he said quietly. Brooks did not respond immediately. The wind moved again, rattling the loose edge of a barn door somewhere behind them. Annie stepped toward a nearby stack of wooden crates and lifted one with surprising ease, carrying it toward the feed room. Brooks watched her go. When she returned a moment later, he addressed her directly. Were you assigned to agricultural duty immediately after arriving in Texas? Annie shook her head. At first I worked in the camp laundry, then in the kitchen. The ranch assignment came later. Brooks considered that. Did you request the transfer? Annie paused briefly before answering. No, sir. The camp officer chose several of us who had experience with animals or farming. I mentioned my grandfather's horses during the interview. Brooks noticed how carefully she spoke, forming each English word with deliberate patience. There was no sign of hesitation caused by fear. Instead, it seemed like someone translating thoughts from one language to another in real time. Cole gestured toward the open pasture beyond the barn. The first week she was here, the horses would not come near anyone else. Annie walked straight into the pasture and stood still until they came to her. Brooks raised an eyebrow. That takes patience. Annie nodded slightly. Animals listen more than people realize. If you are calm, they recognize it. Brooks studied her expression. There was something steady in her presence that did not quite fit the label of prisoner. Not defiant, not submissive, simply composed. A person working within circumstances she had not chosen but had decided to navigate with dignity. Brooks turned back toward Cole. How often do Army guards check on the labor assignments here? Once every few days, Cole answered. Sometimes once a week if the roads are rough. They count heads, ask a few questions, then they drive back to town. Brooks knew that system well. The camps across Texas managed hundreds of agricultural placements. Most inspections were brief because the program depended heavily on trust. Trust that the prisoners would work. Trust that the ranchers would follow the regulations. Trust that no situation would grow complicated enough to require closer scrutiny. Brooks looked around the barn once more. The ranch appeared calm, functional. No raised voices. No tension. Yet the message in his pocket still existed, written by someone who believed this quiet place deserved investigation. Annie stepped toward the doorway, glancing out toward the pasture where the horses had gathered beneath a line of mesquite trees. The heat will be stronger this afternoon, she said quietly. The animals should move closer to the shade soon. Cole nodded in agreement. Brooks watched the exchange carefully. They spoke like co-workers discussing the day ahead. No hesitation. No visible boundary between prisoner and employer beyond the uniform Brooks himself wore. The barn remained silent for a moment except for the faint rustle of hay shifting somewhere above them in the loft. Brooks finally spoke again. I will need to understand every detail of the arrangement before I write my report. Cole did not appear concerned. You are welcome to stay as long as you need, he said. Brooks nodded slowly. Outside the barn, the Texas sky stretched endlessly across the horizon, bright and open above the wide land. Somewhere in the distance a hawk circled slowly in the warm air. Standing there in the shade beside a rancher and a German prisoner calmly discussing water levels and afternoon heat, Major Ethan Brooks realized the situation might challenge more than just a few government rules. It might challenge the assumptions those rules were built upon. The afternoon sun moved slowly across the sky until the wide Texas land shimmered beneath a bright white light that made the horizon appear almost liquid in the distance. By early afternoon, the temperature had passed 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and even the wind seemed to move more slowly as if the air itself had grown tired under the weight of the heat. Major Ethan Brooks sat at the small wooden table on the Bennett Ranch porch with his notebook resting open in front of him. The pages were mostly blank. That fact bothered him more than any complicated report ever had. Investigations usually produced details quickly. Names, times, specific violations of regulations. Yet the longer he observed the ranch, the more the situation resisted simple description. From the porch, he could see the pasture stretching toward the line of mesquite trees where the horses had gathered earlier for shade. Annie Kruger stood near the fence again, adjusting the latch on a narrow gate that separated the smaller grazing field from the larger open pasture. She worked quietly, tightening the wire with a pair of pliers before testing the gate twice to make sure it held properly. The motion was careful and deliberate. When she finished, she wiped her hands on a cloth and looked toward the barn where Cole Bennett was loading feed sacks into the back of a small ranch truck. The entire scene looked ordinary. So ordinary that it would not have attracted a second glance from anyone passing along the dusty road outside the ranch gate. Yet Brooks knew that somewhere inside a War Department office this ordinary scene had been described with a very different tone. Possible irregular contact. That phrase echoed in his mind as he watched Annie walk across the yard carrying a small metal bucket toward the pump. She filled it halfway and carried it to the shaded side of the barn where a ranch dog lay stretched out against the cool boards. The animal lifted its head lazily, drank for several seconds, then settled back into the shade. Annie placed the bucket beside the wall and returned to the pump without saying a word to anyone. Brooks leaned back in his chair and tapped the end of his pencil lightly against the notebook page. The regulations were clear enough. Prisoners assigned to civilian agricultural work were expected to remain under clear supervision and maintain professional distance from the families employing them. Meals were usually taken separately. Living arrangements were strictly defined. Interaction was supposed to remain limited to necessary instructions. Yet everything Brooks had seen during the past several hours suggested something. Quieter had developed here. Annie did not move through the ranch like a temporary laborer waiting for orders. She moved like someone who understood the rhythms of the place, like someone who had already learned where the tools belonged, when the animals needed water, how the wind shifted across the pasture before the afternoon heat peaked. Brooks heard the screen door open behind him. Ruth Bennett stepped onto the porch carrying a glass pitcher filled with iced tea that caught the sunlight in pale amber reflections. She placed the pitcher on the table beside Brooks along with a second glass already filled with ice. "It is too hot to sit out here without something cold," she said gently. Brooks nodded in appreciation. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett." Ruth poured the tea slowly, the ice shifting softly against the sides of the glass. She glanced toward the pasture where Annie had begun checking another section of fence line. "She keeps things running smoothly," Ruth said after a moment. Brooks looked up from the notebook. "Annie." Ruth nodded. "The ranch needed someone who notices the small details. Most people only see the work that stands directly in front of them. Annie sees the work that will appear tomorrow." Brooks took a slow sip of the iced tea, letting the coolness settle against the heat that had been building throughout the morning. "And that has not caused problems." Ruth gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Only for people who believe every rule should remain exactly the same forever." Brooks watched Annie again. She had climbed halfway up the fence post to secure a loose wire, and now stepped down carefully, testing the tension with both hands before moving on. The motion reminded Brooks of soldiers checking equipment before a long march. The same quiet discipline. The same careful attention to what might fail if left unattended. From the barn, Cole Bennett called out something about the feed sacks shifting in the truck bed. Annie walked toward him immediately, helping adjust the load so the bags would not slide during the drive to the lower pasture. They worked together with brief exchanges of simple instructions, the kind that developed naturally between people accustomed to working side by side. Brooks closed the notebook slowly. He had been expecting to find something dramatic when he arrived that morning. A clear violation, a rule ignored, a situation that could be explained easily inside an official report. Instead, he had found something far more complicated. A place where the lines between prisoner and worker had softened without anyone formally deciding to erase them. Brooks looked down at the empty notebook page once more. Somewhere in Washington, a clerk would eventually read whatever explanation he wrote. That clerk would not see the dog drinking water in the shade or the careful way Annie tested each fence wire before moving on. The clerk would see only words describing a labor arrangement that had drifted slightly outside the boundaries of military procedure. Brooks finished the last of his tea and set the glass gently on the table. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the ranch yard as the hours moved quietly forward. For the first time since receiving the message that morning, Major Ethan Brooks realized that the real difficulty of his assignment might not be finding evidence of irregular contact. The real difficulty might be explaining why that contact had produced something unexpectedly stable. The heat of the Texas afternoon began to soften as the sun slowly leaned toward the western horizon, though the air still held the dry warmth of a long summer day that had stretched across nearly every acre of the Bennett Ranch. The sky above the open pasture had turned a deeper shade of blue, and the long shadows from the barn and windmill stretched across the dusty ground like quiet markers of time passing. Major Ethan Brooks remained seated on the porch for several minutes after finishing his tea, his notebook still resting open on the table in front of him. The blank page seemed to ask a question he had not yet found the right words to answer. Somewhere far beyond the wide Texas plains, officers in Washington expected clarity. They expected a report that would categorize what he had seen. Either the regulations were being followed or they were not. Either the arrangement was acceptable or it was not. But the longer Brooks watched the quiet movements across the ranch yard, the more he understood that reality often existed somewhere between those clean categories. Annie Kruger walked from the barn toward the well pump again, carrying a length of rope coiled neatly over one shoulder. The motion was steady, confident, almost rhythmic in its simplicity. She secured the rope beside the wooden post where several other tools hung in careful order. Nothing about her movements suggested uncertainty. She worked with the calm focus of someone who had already accepted the rhythm of the land around her. Cole Bennett drove the small ranch truck across the yard toward the lower pasture gate, the tires pressing slow curved tracks into the dry earth. The engine stopped with a soft rumble, and he stepped out, lifting one of the feed sacks from the truck bed with a familiar motion that came from years of repetition. Annie crossed the yard to help him, taking the opposite end of the sack so they could carry it together without spilling the grain. Brooks noticed again how naturally they moved around one another. No hesitation, no visible tension created by the difference in their circumstances. They simply shared the work the way two ranch hands might on any other farm in Texas. The wind shifted across the pasture, carrying the faint scent of warm grass and distant rain clouds that might gather later in the evening. Brooks closed his notebook slowly and stood from the porch chair, stepping down onto the wooden planks with a soft creak beneath his boots. The ranch dog lifted its head briefly from the shaded spot beside the barn, and then settled back into the cool dust when it recognized that nothing unusual was happening. Brooks walked across the yard toward the pasture gate where Cole and Annie had just finished unloading the feed sack. Cole brushed the dust from his hands and nodded in greeting as Brooks approached. "We usually feed the horses closer to sunset," he said. "Keeps them calm in the heat." Brooks looked out across the pasture where the animals had gathered beneath the shade of a cluster of mesquite trees. The wide land stretched in every direction, quiet and patient beneath the long afternoon light. Annie adjusted the latch on the pasture gate before stepping back, her eyes briefly following the movement of the horses across the grass. Major Brooks spoke after a moment. "I have visited many labor placements during the past year. Most of them look different from this." Cole rested one arm against the fence rail. "Different how?" Brooks considered his words carefully. "Usually the boundaries remain visible. Prisoners stand apart. They wait for instructions before moving. They keep their distance from the ranch house and the family." Annie listened quietly beside the gate, her hands resting lightly against the wooden post. Cole glanced toward her and then back toward Brooks. "Maybe that works in some places," he said, "but a ranch does not run well on distance." Brooks nodded slowly. That observation carried more truth than the regulations might have anticipated. A ranch required cooperation. It required people noticing problems before they grew into larger ones. A broken fence wire could let cattle wander miles across open land before anyone realized what had happened. A dry water tank could leave animals struggling beneath the midday sun before help arrived. The work demanded attention from everyone involved. Brooks turned toward Annie. "When you arrived here 3 months ago, did you expect to remain this long?" Annie shook her head gently. "No, sir. At first I thought the assignment would last only a few weeks." Brooks folded his arms across the fence rail. "Yet you stayed." Annie looked out across the pasture where the horses moved slowly toward the feeding area. Her voice remained calm when she answered. "The ranch needed the help." Brooks studied her expression carefully. There was no sense of complaint in her words. No sign that she had ever asked to remain longer than required. Instead, there was something quieter in her tone. A recognition that the work itself had created its own logic over time. The windmill near the barn creaked softly as the breeze turned its metal blades. Brooks listened to the sound for several seconds before speaking again. "In Washington, they will want to understand exactly how this arrangement functions day to day." Cole gave a small nod. "Then you should see it for yourself. The evening work begins soon." Annie opened the pasture gate and stepped aside as Cole carried the feed sack toward the trough near the fence line. The horses lifted their heads at the sound of grain pouring into the metal container, their ears turning toward the familiar noise. Brooks remained by the fence watching the quiet efficiency of the moment unfold. The animals approached calmly, their hooves pressing soft patterns into the dry earth as the sunlight shifted across the pasture. Annie stood near the gate, observing the horses with the same steady attention she had given every task throughout the day. Nothing in the scene resembled the tension Brooks had expected when he first received the message that morning. Instead, the ranch seemed to move forward with the quiet rhythm of work that had been repeated day after day across the wide Texas land. And standing there beside the fence as the evening shadows began to stretch across the pasture, Major Ethan Brooks realized that the real question waiting inside his report might not be whether the arrangement had drifted beyond the written rules. The real question might be why the work itself seemed to function better because of it. The evening light across the Bennett Ranch turned softer as the sun drifted lower behind the distant hills, spreading long golden shadows across the pasture that stretched almost endlessly beyond the fence line. The air was still warm, but the sharp edge of the afternoon heat had begun to fade, replaced by a calmer breeze that carried the scent of dry grass and distant cedar trees across the land. Major Ethan Brooks stood beside the wooden fence watching the horses gather around the trough where Cole Bennett had just poured the grain. The animals moved calmly, their heads lowering toward the feed while their tails swayed slowly against the quiet evening air. Annie Kruger stood a few yards away near the gate, one hand resting lightly on the wooden latch as she watched the horses with the patient attention she had shown all day. Nothing in her posture suggested urgency. She simply observed, the way someone who understood animals often did, allowing them to settle naturally before stepping closer. Brooks noticed again how the animals seemed comfortable with her presence. One of the younger horses stepped away from the trough briefly, walking toward her before lowering its head as if expecting a familiar gesture. Annie lifted her hand slowly and ran her fingers along the animal's neck, speaking softly in a language Brooks did not recognize at first. After a moment he realized she was speaking German, her voice calm and steady. The horse stood quietly beside her, as if the language itself did not matter, only the tone. Cole closed the empty feed sack and leaned it against the fence post before glancing toward Brooks. Horses listen to how you speak more than what you say, he explained. Brooks nodded thoughtfully. That seemed consistent with everything he had observed since arriving that morning. The ranch moved according to rhythms that had little to do with formal rules and everything to do with quiet understanding. The animals, the land, the people working together across it all seemed to respond more to tone and consistency than to official instructions written on distant office paper. The windmill near the barn turned slowly as the breeze shifted again, its metal blades catching the fading sunlight, while the faint creaking sound drifted across the pasture. Brooks rested his arms on the fence rail, watching the horses finish their grain. The quiet scene contrasted sharply with the structured world he had left behind in San Angelo that morning. In the office, everything was measured by reports, regulations, and clear definitions. Out here, the boundaries seemed less rigid. Work followed necessity instead of paperwork. Annie stepped away from the horse and moved toward the trough to check the remaining grain. She brushed a small clump of feed from the edge so it would not attract insects overnight, then wiped her hands against the cloth tied at her waist. Brooks spoke after a moment of silence. "You seem to understand the animals well." Annie looked toward him with a calm expression. "They are easier to understand than people sometimes." Brooks allowed a faint smile. "That may be true." Cole pushed himself away from the fence rail and looked across the pasture where the last of the sunlight was touching the distant hills. "We usually check the lower water tank before dark," he said. "The horses drink more after feeding." Annie nodded and walked toward the barn where a lantern hung from a nail beside the door. She lifted it carefully, though the fading daylight still provided enough visibility for now. Brooks followed Cole along the fence path that led toward the lower section of the pasture. The ground sloped gently downward there, the grass growing thicker where the soil held more moisture beneath the surface. Annie walked a few steps ahead, carrying the lantern by its metal handle, though she did not light it yet. The sky above them had begun to soften into shades of orange and pale purple as the sun approached the horizon. Brooks noticed how naturally Annie moved along the narrow path that cut through the pasture grass. She avoided the loose stones without looking down, stepping over a small dip in the ground where water sometimes collected after rain. That familiarity again suggested more than just 3 months of temporary labor. It suggested attention, learning, a willingness to observe the land carefully enough to move through it without hesitation. They reached the lower water tank after a few minutes. Cole lifted the metal lid and looked inside while Annie set the lantern beside the wooden post supporting the tank. The water level remained steady, enough for the animals through the night. Cole replaced the lid and brushed a line of dust from the edge with his hand. Brooks watched the exchange quietly. It struck him that every task on the ranch involved small acts of responsibility shared between the people present. No one issued formal orders. No one waited for permission to complete the work that clearly needed doing. Annie noticed a loose bolt along the side of the tank and tightened it with a small wrench she had brought from the barn earlier. The action took less than a minute, yet Brooks recognized its significance. Details like that often separated a well-maintained ranch from one slowly drifting toward disorder. Cole looked toward the western horizon, where the sun now touched the edge of the hills. "We should head back before it gets too dark to see the path clearly," he said. Annie picked up the lantern again, still unlit, and began walking back toward the barn. Brooks followed a few steps behind, the quiet sounds of evening settling around them as the day finally began to close. Crickets had started their soft rhythm in the grass, and the wind carried a cooler hint of night across the pasture. When they reached the barn again, Annie hung the lantern back on its nail without lighting it. The last glow of daylight still reached across the yard, illuminating the ranch house porch where Ruth Bennett had begun setting plates on the small wooden table. Brooks paused near the barn door and looked once more across the wide land that had quietly reshaped his expectations throughout the day. The message he had received that morning had asked him to investigate irregular contact between a prisoner and a ranch family. Standing there now beneath the fading Texas sky, he realized that what he had witnessed was not disorder. It was something far more subtle. A place where necessity and trust had gradually reshaped the lines drawn by distant regulations. And the longer he remained on the ranch, the clearer it became that explaining that quiet transformation might be the most difficult part of his assignment. The last light of the Texas evening settled gently across the Bennett ranch as the sun slipped behind the distant hills, leaving the wide sky painted in long bands of orange, rose, and fading gold. The land cooled slowly after the heat of the day, and the breeze that moved across the pasture carried a softer feeling now, almost like the ranch itself was breathing out after hours of steady work. Major Ethan Brooks stood near the barn door watching the quiet transition from day into night. The horses had finished feeding and drifted back toward the shade of the mesquite trees, their shapes dark against the fading horizon. Annie Kruger moved across the yard toward the pump once more, rinsing the last traces of grain dust from her hands before placing the metal bucket upside down beside the wooden post where the tools were kept. The motion was small but deliberate, the kind of action that came from habit rather than instruction. Brooks had begun to notice that nearly every task she performed followed the same pattern. Nothing rushed, nothing careless. The ranch functioned through hundreds of small attentions like that, each one preventing a larger problem later. The screen door of the ranch house opened with a gentle creak and Ruth Bennett stepped onto the porch carrying a lantern that glowed softly against the deepening twilight. She hung it on the hook beside the door, and the warm circle of light spread across the porch boards and the small wooden table where dinner plates had already been arranged. The smell of fresh bread and slow-cooked beans drifted across the yard, mixing with the cool scent of evening grass. Cole Bennett walked toward the porch, brushing dust from his hat before stepping onto the wooden boards. Annie followed a few steps behind him, but stopped near the edge of the yard instead of climbing the porch steps. Brooks noticed that pause immediately. All day she had moved naturally through the work of the ranch, yet when evening arrived, she remained careful about the boundary between the house and the yard. Ruth looked toward her and spoke gently across the fading light. "Annie, you worked as hard as anyone today. Come sit and eat." Annie hesitated for a moment before answering in her steady, measured English. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett, but I can eat later." Ruth gave a small smile that carried both patience and quiet understanding. "The food is already warm. It will not wait forever." Annie glanced briefly toward Major Brooks, as if aware that his presence made the moment more complicated than usual. Brooks understood the silent calculation immediately. The regulations he carried in his mind still existed, even here in the fading evening light. Prisoners assigned to agricultural work were expected to remain separate from the households they served. Meals were normally taken apart from the family. The rule was clear on paper. Yet the ranch itself had never been designed to operate according to distant paperwork. Brooks looked from Annie to Ruth, and then toward Cole, who leaned casually against the porch rail watching the quiet exchange. The rancher did not appear concerned. He simply waited, as if trusting the moment to find its own balance. Brooks spoke calmly. Mrs. Bennet invited her. Annie looked at him with quiet attention. Brooks continued after a brief pause. I see no reason the evening meal cannot be shared today. The words were simple, but their effect shifted the air slightly across the porch. Annie studied his expression for a moment, as if confirming that he meant exactly what he had said. Then she stepped slowly toward the porch and climbed the wooden steps. The lantern light caught the dust on her sleeves, and the faint line of sunlight still lingering in her hair from the long day outside. Ruth pulled out a chair beside the table, and Annie sat carefully, placing her hands together for a moment before reaching for the bread Ruth passed across the table. Brooks took the remaining chair, while Cole settled into his usual place near the corner of the porch rail. For a few minutes the four of them ate quietly, the soft sounds of utensils against plates mixing with the gentle chorus of crickets rising from the pasture grass. The sky above them had deepened to a rich shade of indigo, and the first stars appeared above the far hills. Annie spoke only occasionally, answering Ruth's questions about the horses or the fence repairs they had finished earlier that afternoon. Her voice remained calm, respectful, never reaching beyond what the moment required. Brooks listened more than he spoke, observing the subtle ways the ranch family included her without making the inclusion feel unusual. No one treated the moment like an exception. They simply shared the food and the quiet evening air the way people often did after a long day of work. When the meal finished, Annie gathered the plates and carried them inside without being asked. Ruth followed her into the kitchen, and the sound of running water soon drifted through the open screen door. Cole leaned back in his chair and looked across the dark pasture where the lantern light barely reached beyond the edge of the yard. Major Brooks, he said after a moment, you have seen how things work here. Brooks nodded slowly. I have. Cole did not press further. He simply watched the night settle over the ranch with the same patience he showed toward the land itself. A few minutes later, Annie returned to the porch and hung the dishcloth beside the door before stepping back into the yard. The lantern light illuminated the quiet determination in her posture as she looked out across the pasture where the horses moved slowly beneath the rising moon. Brooks followed her gaze and realized something important had changed during the evening. The ranch had not asked permission to become a place where trust mattered more than distance. It had simply grown that way through the quiet decisions of the people living and working there every day. And now, standing beneath the wide Texas night, Major Ethan Brooks understood that whatever report he eventually wrote would have to explain not only what he had observed, but also why that quiet trust had taken root so naturally on this small piece of land. The night settled fully over the Bennett Ranch with a calm that felt almost deliberate, as if the wide Texas land itself understood the value of quiet after a long day of labor. The sky above the pasture had deepened into a vast field of stars, brighter than anything visible in the cities where Major Ethan Brooks usually spent his nights. Out here the darkness carried its own clarity. Every fence line, every distant hill, every slow movement of the horses across the pasture appeared beneath the pale glow of the rising moon. Brooks remained on the porch after dinner. His notebook, still lying open on the table beside the empty glass Ruth Bennett had filled earlier with iced tea. He had written only a few lines since arriving that morning. Each sentence felt incomplete, as if the language of military procedure could not quite capture the steady rhythm of life he had witnessed throughout the day. Inside the house, Ruth moved quietly through the kitchen, the soft sound of dishes being dried and placed into cabinets drifting through the open screen door. Cole Bennett had stepped down from the porch and walked toward the barn to check the lanterns that hung beside the stall doors. Annie Kruger stood near the edge of the yard facing the pasture, her posture relaxed but attentive the way it had been every time she looked toward the animals. Brooks watched her for a moment before standing and stepping down from the porch boards onto the packed dirt below. The ranch dog lifted its head briefly and wagged its tail once before settling again into the dust where the ground still held a trace of the day's warmth. Brooks walked slowly toward Annie until he stood beside her at the edge of the yard. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The night breeze moved gently through the grass, and the faint sound of insects formed a steady background rhythm across the fields. Brooks finally broke the silence. You have adapted well to this place. Annie looked out across the pasture where the horses moved like quiet shadows beneath the moonlight. The land teaches patience, she said softly. Brooks folded his arms loosely across his chest. Did you expect to find something like this when you first arrived in America? Annie gave a small shake of her head. When we were transported across the ocean, no one knew where we would be sent. Some believed we would remain in camps for the rest of the war. Others thought we might be moved from place to place, depending on the work needed. She paused briefly, choosing her next words carefully in English. I did not expect to find a ranch where the work feels familiar. Brooks glanced toward the barn where Cole had just finished lighting a lantern beside the stall door. The warm glow spilled across the ground in a wide circle before fading into the deeper darkness beyond the fence line. Yet the arrangement here is unusual, Brooks said quietly. Annie nodded once. Yes. Brooks studied her profile in the moonlight. Most prisoners assigned to farms do not become part of the routine this way. They remain separate. Annie's gaze remained fixed on the pasture. At first I tried to remain separate, she replied. Brooks raised an eyebrow slightly. What changed? Annie considered the question for several seconds. The animals needed care. The fences needed repair. The water tanks needed checking. She turned her head slightly toward Brooks. The work did not wait for permission. Brooks allowed a faint, thoughtful smile. That explanation sounded simple, but it carried a quiet logic that was difficult to argue with. The ranch dog rose slowly and walked across the yard toward the barn where Cole was securing the last stall door for the night. Annie watched the movement for a moment before speaking again. When people share work every day, it becomes difficult to maintain distance forever. Brooks nodded. The regulations were written by people who believe distance prevents problems. Annie's expression remained calm. Sometimes distance prevents understanding. The wind shifted across the pasture again, carrying the scent of cooling earth and dry grass beneath the wide sky. Brooks looked down at his notebook, still resting on the porch table behind them. Tomorrow he would need to begin writing the full report. The War Department expected clarity, a recommendation, something that could be filed and understood without visiting the ranch itself. Yet the conversation unfolding beneath the moonlight reminded him again that the situation here was shaped by countless small decisions rather than one deliberate violation of the rules. Cole walked back toward the yard, wiping his hands against a cloth as he approached. The horses are settled for the night, he said quietly. Annie nodded and stepped aside to allow him to pass through the gate. Brooks turned toward him. Mr. Bennett, have any officials from the Army expressed concern about this arrangement before today? Cole thought for a moment. A few officers have asked questions during routine inspections, he answered. But most of them saw the same thing you have seen today. Work being done. Animals cared for. Fences standing where they should stand. Brooks looked across the pasture again. That may not satisfy everyone in Washington. Cole gave a quiet chuckle. Washington is a long way from this ranch. The statement carried no disrespect, only a simple acknowledgement of the distance between policy and daily labor. Annie stepped back from the gate and brushed a small line of dust from her sleeve. Brooks noticed again how composed she remained, even while discussing a situation that could easily affect her future. He asked her one final question before the night grew too late. If the Army decides to end this arrangement and return you to the camp, what will you do? Annie answered without hesitation. I will follow the orders given to me. Brooks studied her expression carefully. And the ranch? Annie looked across the land once more before replying. The ranch will continue its work. The animals will still need water. The fences will still need repair. Her voice remained steady. The work existed before I arrived, and it will exist after I leave. Brooks recognized the quiet dignity in those words. Annie did not speak as someone trying to defend her place here. She spoke as someone who understood that the land itself was larger than any single person. The lantern light from the barn flickered gently in the night breeze, while the horses shifted softly in the pasture beyond. Standing there beneath the wide Texas sky, Major Ethan Brooks realized that the story unfolding on this ranch was not really about a violation of rules. It was about how people from different worlds had slowly learned to share responsibility for the same piece of ground. And that realization would make the report he needed to write far more complicated than the message that had sent him here in the first place. The night deepened across the Bennett Ranch until the sky above the wide Texas plain looked almost endless, a dark ocean scattered with quiet stars that seemed brighter the longer a person stood still beneath them. The lantern near the barn swayed slightly in the breeze, its soft yellow glow forming a circle of light that barely touched the ground beyond the stall doors. Major Ethan Brooks remained standing near the edge of the yard for a long time after their conversation had ended, listening to the distant sounds that marked the slow rhythm of night on the ranch. A horse shifted its weight somewhere in the pasture. The windmill creaked once as the wind changed direction. The insects in the grass continued their steady chorus, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Yet Brooks knew that something unusual had happened, even if it could not easily be described. The War Department message that had brought him here expected answers built from clear categories. Either regulations had been followed or they had not. Either the arrangement on this ranch was acceptable or it required correction. The simplicity of those categories had made sense inside the office where Brooks had first read the message. Out here, standing beneath the open sky where the land stretched for miles in every direction, the situation felt less rigid. Annie Kruger still stood near the pasture gate, watching the quiet shapes of the horses as they moved slowly through the grass. Cole Bennett had disappeared briefly into the barn to check the last of the stall latches, while the faint glow from the kitchen window showed that Ruth Bennett was finishing the final chores of the evening inside the house. Brooks turned slowly and walked back toward the porch where his notebook waited on the small wooden table. The lantern near the door cast just enough light for him to see the blank page he had been avoiding all day. He sat down and picked up the pencil again, resting the tip against the paper without writing for several seconds. The difficulty was not the absence of facts. Brooks had seen everything clearly during the long hours since morning. Annie worked on the ranch. She helped maintain the fences, the animals, the water tanks. She ate dinner with the family that evening after an invitation that Brooks himself had quietly approved. Those facts could easily be written in a few sentences. The challenge was explaining why none of those actions had produced the disorder the regulations were designed to prevent. Brooks finally wrote a single line across the top of the page. Observation of agricultural labor placement at Bennett Ranch, Tom Green County, Texas. The words looked stiff and official beneath the lantern light. He paused again and glanced across the yard where Annie still stood near the fence. She had not returned to the porch after dinner. Instead, she seemed content to remain near the pasture, observing the horses the way someone might watch the quiet movement of waves along a shoreline. Brooks realized that her presence there had become a kind of reassurance for the animals. Even in the darkness, they remained calm, moving slowly between the trough and the open grass. Brooks returned his attention to the notebook and wrote another sentence beneath the first. Subject assigned to ranch labor duties approximately 3 months prior to inspection. The placement appears to have developed beyond initial temporary rotation. He stopped again, recognizing how easily those words might sound suspicious to someone reading the report in Washington. Developed beyond initial rotation. That phrase alone could raise concerns in the minds of officers who believed every program should follow strict timelines. Brooks rested the pencil against the table and leaned back in the chair, looking up at the wide night sky above the porch roof. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called across the hills, its voice carrying through the cool air before fading into silence again. The sound reminded Brooks of the open land he had known during childhood in Oklahoma before joining the Army. Back then the world had seemed simple. Work was defined by the needs of the land. You repaired a fence because the cattle needed a fence. You checked the water tank because the animals needed water. No one wrote reports about those decisions. Brooks sat forward again and continued writing slowly. Daily operations at the ranch appear stable. Subject demonstrates familiarity with livestock handling, maintenance tasks, and water management procedures. Cooperation between ranch family and labor placement observed throughout inspection period. He stopped once more and read the lines carefully. The language was factual, neutral, yet it still avoided the deeper question forming in his mind. Why had the arrangement succeeded where other placements often remained awkward and distant? Annie turned slightly near the fence, as if sensing Brooks looking in her direction. For a moment their eyes met across the lantern light and the quiet darkness between them. She nodded once, a simple gesture that carried neither expectation nor concern. Then she returned her attention to the pasture. Brooks realized then that Annie herself had never tried to justify her place on the ranch. She had simply worked. She had repaired fences, fed animals, checked water tanks, and shared responsibility for the land in the same steady way she had described earlier. The work did not wait for permission. Brooks lowered his gaze back to the notebook and began writing again, this time more slowly, choosing each word with care. No evidence observed of disruption to ranch operations or violation of labor expectations affecting productivity. Subject performs duties comparable to experienced ranch hand. Working environment remains orderly and cooperative. When he finished the sentence, he placed the pencil down and studied the page for several seconds. The report was still incomplete. It did not fully explain the quiet trust that had formed between the people on this ranch. But perhaps that trust did not require explanation in the formal language of military reports. Perhaps it only required acknowledgement that the arrangement functioned. The screen door opened behind him and Ruth Bennett stepped onto the porch carrying a folded cloth. "I thought you might still be working on that report," she said gently. Brooks looked up and gave a small nod. "I am trying to find the right words." Ruth smiled faintly as she hung the cloth beside the door. "Sometimes the right words are the simplest ones," she said. Brooks glanced back at the notebook where the lantern light illuminated the lines he had already written. The ranch yard remained quiet beyond the porch steps, the horses calm in the pasture, and the windmill turning slowly beneath the starlit sky. And for the first time since receiving the War Department message that morning, Major Ethan Brooks began to believe that the truth he needed to report might indeed be simple. The lantern light on the Bennett Ranch porch burned steadily through the quiet Texas night, its soft glow forming a small island of warmth beneath the wide sky, filled with stars. Major Ethan Brooks remained seated at the wooden table long after Ruth Bennett had stepped back inside the house. The notebook lay open before him, the words he had written earlier now catching the faint flicker of the lantern flame. The air had cooled noticeably since sunset, and the breeze drifting across the pasture carried the earthy scent of grass and dust settling after the long day. Brooks listened to the steady rhythm of the ranch at night. A horse shifted slowly near the trough. The windmill creaked again as its blades turned lazily against the dark horizon. Far beyond the pasture fence, a distant train whistle echoed faintly across the open plains, reminding him that the world beyond this quiet ranch continued moving forward with its own urgency. Yet here, time seemed to slow in a way that allowed every small detail to settle clearly into place. Annie Kruger still stood near the pasture gate, though she had moved a few steps closer to the fence where the horses now grazed quietly under the moonlight. She rested one hand lightly on the wooden rail, her posture relaxed but attentive as she watched the animals move across the grass. The lantern light did not reach her there, but the pale glow of the moon outlined her silhouette against the open field. Brooks looked down again at the notebook page. The report was no longer completely blank. Several lines of careful observations filled the top half of the paper, written in the precise handwriting he had developed during years of military service. Yet something about the page still felt unfinished. The sentences described the ranch operations accurately, but they did not quite capture the quiet understanding that had developed among the people working here. Brooks lifted the pencil again and considered what to write next. He knew the officers reading this report would look for specific recommendations. Should the arrangement continue? Should the prisoner be reassigned? Should the placement return to stricter supervision? Those were the questions waiting beyond the ranch gates. Brooks tapped the pencil lightly against the edge of the table as he thought. The difficulty was not deciding what he believed. The difficulty was explaining that belief in language that would be accepted by the system responsible for enforcing the rules. From inside the house, the soft sound of a cupboard door closing drifted through the screen door. Ruth Bennett stepped onto the porch again, this time carrying a small kettle of hot coffee. She poured a cup and placed it beside Brooks without interrupting his thoughts. "Long nights and paperwork usually go together," she said gently. Brooks smiled slightly and thanked her. The warmth of the coffee rose in the cool night air as he lifted the cup and took a slow sip. Ruth remained standing near the porch rail for a moment, looking out toward the pasture where Annie still stood watching the horses. "She has always been that way," Ruth said quietly. Brooks looked up from the notebook. "Always watching the animals. Always noticing when something is not quite right before anyone else does." Brooks followed her gaze toward the pasture. "That kind of attention keeps a ranch running," he said. Ruth nodded. "And sometimes it keeps people running too." Brooks lowered his eyes back to the notebook again. The lantern light flickered gently as he began writing once more. During inspection period, subject demonstrated consistent responsibility for livestock care and ranch maintenance. Interaction between subject and ranch family remained respectful and cooperative. No indication observed that the arrangement compromises security or operational stability. He paused briefly after finishing the sentence, then added another line beneath it. Environment appears structured by shared work responsibilities rather than formal hierarchy. Brooks read the sentence again, aware that it might raise questions among officers accustomed to stricter definitions of authority. Yet it also felt closer to the truth he had witnessed throughout the day. The ranch functioned not because someone enforced distance, but because everyone present contributed to the same tasks. Brooks set the pencil down and leaned back slightly in his chair. Ruth had stepped back inside the house again, leaving the porch quiet except for the soft lantern glow and the distant movement of the horses. A few minutes later, Cole Bennett emerged from the barn and walked toward the porch with the slow, relaxed stride of someone who had finished the last chores of the evening. He rested one hand on the porch rail and looked toward Brooks. "Still working on that report, Major?" Brooks nodded. "I want to be certain it reflects what I have seen here." Cole studied him for a moment before speaking. "The truth usually works better than complicated explanations." Brooks allowed a quiet laugh. "That may be the most difficult part of writing a report." Cole did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked across the pasture where Annie had finally stepped away from the fence and begun walking slowly toward the barn. The horses remained calm behind her, their dark shapes barely visible in the moonlight. Cole spoke again after a moment. "The ranch does not belong to us alone, Major. It belongs to the work that keeps it alive." Brooks considered the words carefully. They echoed something Annie had said earlier about the work existing before she arrived and continuing after she left. The idea carried a simple dignity that did not depend on rank or nationality. Brooks turned back to the notebook and wrote the final lines for the night. Based on direct observation, the current labor placement functions effectively and contributes positively to ranch operations. Recommendation pending further administrative review, but no immediate corrective action appears necessary. He placed the pencil down once more and closed the notebook slowly. The report was not complete, but the direction was now clear. The lantern light flickered softly against the wooden boards of the porch as Brooks looked out across the quiet ranch yard. Annie had reached the barn and paused briefly beside the stall door where the lantern still glowed. For a moment, she looked back toward the pasture before stepping inside to check the horses one final time for the night. Watching that small gesture, Brooks understood something that had not been obvious when he first arrived that morning. The arrangement on this ranch had not succeeded because anyone ignored the rules. It had succeeded because the people involved had chosen to honor something deeper than the rules. And that realization would shape every word he wrote in the report that would soon travel back to Washington. The night on the Bennett Ranch gradually deepened until even the lantern light near the barn seemed smaller beneath the enormous Texas sky. The stars above stretched in quiet constellations that felt close enough to touch, brighter than anywhere Major Ethan Brooks had seen during his years moving between military bases and administrative offices. Out here there were no city lights to dull the sky, only open land and silence. Brooks remained seated on the porch long after closing his notebook. The lantern beside him flickered softly against the wooden boards while the cool night air settled across the ranch yard. From the barn came the faint sound of a horse shifting in its stall, followed by the quiet rustle of hay being moved under careful hands. Annie Kruger stepped out from the barn a moment later, closing the stall door gently behind her before checking the latch one final time. The lantern hanging beside the barn cast a warm glow across her shoulders, illuminating the dust still clinging to her sleeves from the day's work. She paused there briefly, looking across the pasture as if confirming that everything remained calm before turning back toward the yard. Brooks watched her approach slowly across the open ground. There was something steady in the way she moved, the same calm rhythm he had noticed since arriving that morning. No wasted motion, no visible uncertainty, just quiet attention to the responsibilities that came with the land around her. Annie stopped a few steps from the porch and looked up toward Brooks, who remained seated beside the lantern. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night breeze moved gently through the grass beyond the fence line, and the distant sound of crickets formed a steady background chorus across the dark fields. Brooks finally broke the silence. The horses looked settled for the night. Annie nodded once. "They will rest until early morning." Brooks leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her expression in the lantern light. Tomorrow I will return to San Angelo. The words hung quietly between them. Annie did not appear surprised. She simply nodded again as if she had already expected that moment to arrive. Your report will decide what happens next, she said softly. Brooks considered the statement carefully. The report would certainly travel beyond this ranch. It would be read by officers who had never stood beneath this sky or watched the quiet routines that kept the ranch alive. Yet, even as Annie spoke the words, Brooks understood that the report itself might not hold as much power as people believed. Decisions in Washington often followed patterns shaped by many reports, many voices, many interpretations of the same events. Brooks answered slowly. The report will describe what I have seen here. Annie looked toward the pasture again before replying. That may be enough. Brooks watched her for a moment longer. Earlier you said the work existed before you arrived and will continue after you leave. Annie nodded. That is true. Brooks folded his hands loosely together. Does that make leaving easier to accept? Annie considered the question in silence. The lantern near the porch flickered again as the breeze shifted slightly across the yard. Finally she spoke. Accepting reality is easier than fighting something that cannot be changed. Brooks recognized the quiet strength behind the words. Annie did not speak like someone waiting for rescue or pleading for approval. She spoke like someone who had already made peace with the uncertain road ahead. Cole Bennett stepped out from the barn a moment later, brushing dust from his hands as he joined them near the porch steps. Horses are calm, he said. They should sleep well tonight. Brooks nodded and glanced once more toward the dark pasture beyond the fence. The land seemed almost still beneath the moonlight now, the wide open space holding the kind of silence that could only exist far from cities and crowded roads. Cole leaned lightly against the porch rail and looked toward Brooks. Leaving in the morning, Major? Yes, Brooks replied. Early. Cole nodded thoughtfully. The road back to town is clearer before the heat builds. Brooks knew the rancher was speaking about more than just the temperature. Morning departures were simpler. Fewer questions. Fewer lingering conversations beneath the weight of night. Annie stepped back slightly from the porch, her gaze returning once more to the pasture where the horses rested quietly behind the fence. Brooks followed her gaze. For a brief moment, he imagined how the land must have looked before the war had ever touched any of their lives. Just ranchers, animals, and endless fields of grass moving beneath the same sky. The war had carried Annie across an ocean and placed her on this ranch through a chain of decisions none of them could have predicted. Yet here she had become part of the daily rhythm that kept the land alive. Brooks stood slowly from his chair and closed the notebook resting on the table. Tomorrow he would carry it back to the office in San Angelo where the report would be completed and sent onward through the quiet channels of military administration. He looked toward Annie one final time beneath the lantern glow. No matter what happens after the report is filed, he said quietly, the work you have done here will not disappear. Annie met his gaze calmly. Work leaves its mark on the land. Brooks nodded, and sometimes on the people who see it. The wind moved across the pasture again, stirring the tall grass in slow waves beneath the moonlight. Cole glanced toward the dark horizon where the faint outline of distant hills stood against the star-filled sky. Morning comes early out here, he said. Brooks allowed a faint smile. That is something the army and ranchers have in common. Annie stepped away from the porch then, walking toward the small shed where her sleeping quarters had been arranged near the barn. Her footsteps faded softly into the night as the lantern light grew dimmer with distance. Brooks watched until she disappeared into the shadows beside the barn door. The ranch yard returned to silence once more. Standing there beneath the vast Texas sky, Major Ethan Brooks understood that the story of this place would continue long after his car carried him away at sunrise. And the quiet truth he had witnessed here would soon travel beyond the ranch in the form of a report written not about suspicion or violation, but about something far more unexpected. Morning arrived quietly over the Bennett Ranch, the first pale light of dawn spreading slowly across the wide Texas horizon as if the land itself were waking with careful patience. The air held a cool stillness that only existed for a short time before the heat of the day returned, and a thin layer of dew clung to the grass near the pasture fence where the horses stood motionless in the soft gray light. Major Ethan Brooks stepped out onto the porch just as the sky began to brighten. The lantern beside the door had already burned low during the night, its flame now faint against the growing glow of sunrise. Brooks paused there for a moment, breathing in the quiet air and listening to the early sounds of the ranch returning to life. Somewhere near the barn, a horse stamped gently against the ground. The windmill creaked once as a light breeze moved across the open land. Beyond the distant hills, the sky slowly shifted from gray to pale gold. Brooks had risen early out of habit. Years in the army had trained him to wake before sunrise whether he needed to or not. His car waited near the gate where he had parked it the day before, its metal surface already catching the first thin rays of morning light. The road back to San Angelo stretched empty beyond the ranch fence, a narrow ribbon of dust cutting through miles of open Texas land. The notebook containing his inspection report rested inside his jacket pocket. The words he had written during the night felt settled now, as if they had found their proper place sometime between the last lantern flicker and the first light of dawn. The screen door behind him opened quietly, and Ruth Bennett stepped onto the porch carrying a small tin mug filled with hot coffee. She handed it to Brooks with a warm smile that carried the calm steadiness of someone accustomed to early mornings on the ranch. "Leaving already, Major?" Brooks nodded as he accepted the mug. "The drive back is easier before the sun climbs too high." Ruth looked across the yard where the barn door had just opened. Cole Bennett stepped out carrying a small feed bucket, his hat already settled low against the morning light. Annie Kruger followed a few steps behind him, moving with the same steady confidence Brooks had watched the entire previous day. She crossed the yard toward the pump and began filling the bucket with water before carrying it toward the barn stalls where the horses waited for the first feeding of the day. The scene unfolded with quiet familiarity. No ceremony. No special attention to the fact that Brooks would soon be leaving. The ranch simply continued its work the way it always had. Brooks finished the coffee and set the mug carefully on the porch railing before stepping down into the yard. The cool ground beneath his boots still held traces of moisture from the night air. Cole looked up from the feed bucket as Brooks approached. "Safe drive back to town, Major," he said. Brooks nodded. "Thank you for allowing me to observe the ranch operations." Cole shrugged lightly, as if the situation had never been complicated. "You saw what there was to see." Annie had just finished placing water inside the stall when Brooks reached the barn doorway. She stepped back into the morning light and met his gaze with the same calm expression she had carried through every moment of the previous day. The horses behind her lowered their heads toward the feed bucket Cole had placed along the stall rail, their quiet movements filling the barn with the gentle sounds of early morning routine. Brooks removed his hat briefly as he spoke. "I will deliver the report today." Annie nodded once. "The decision will belong to others then." Brooks considered the words carefully. "Yes," he said, "but the truth will belong to what I have seen here." Annie looked across the pasture where the sunlight had begun to spill across the grass in long golden lines. The land looked peaceful beneath the growing light, the fences stretching outward across miles of open ground. "Work begins early here," she said quietly. Brooks followed her gaze. The ranch was already alive with motion. Cole was checking the harness straps near the barn wall. Ruth had begun sweeping the porch boards with slow practice strokes. The horses moved calmly through the stalls while the windmill turned gently above the water tank. None of it required explanation. It simply existed because people had chosen to care for it. Brooks placed his hat back on his head and extended his hand toward Annie. She accepted the gesture without hesitation, her grip steady and respectful. "Thank you for showing me how the ranch works," Brooks said. Annie released his hand and gave a small nod. "Sometimes people understand more by watching than by asking questions." Brooks allowed a faint smile. "That is something I will remember." He turned and walked toward the gate where the army sedan waited. The engine started with a low rumble that broke the quiet of the morning for only a moment. Brooks paused once more before pulling onto the road and looked back across the ranch yard. Cole had returned to the barn. Ruth continued sweeping the porch. Annie walked toward the pasture gate to release the horses for their morning grazing. The scene looked almost identical to the way the day had begun 24 hours earlier when Brooks first arrived. Yet something had changed. The ranch no longer felt like a place under investigation. It felt like a place that had simply revealed its quiet truth to anyone willing to watch closely enough. Brooks guided the car through the gate and onto the dusty road leading back toward San Angelo. As the ranch slowly disappeared behind him in the rearview mirror, the rising sun spread warm light across the endless Texas plain. Inside his jacket pocket, the completed report rested quietly against his chest. The words he had written would travel soon to offices far from this land, where officials might read them and wonder how a situation that appeared unusual on paper had produced such steady results in reality. But Brooks already understood the answer. The ranch had not changed the rules through argument or defiance. It had simply lived according to a quieter principle that existed long before any war. Because sometimes the strongest order in the world is not the one written in a government manual. Sometimes it is the one carried quietly in the way people choose to treat one another when no one else is watching.